Introducing an all-new channel, JG9 News, where we talk about all things happening in the NFL that don't get talked about on this channel, in a completely relaxed, unscripted format. Newest video is up, where I talk about the Week 18 schedule, and also talk about Dalvin Cook joining the Baltimore Ravens. So go check that out and subscribe. And now, on with our feature presentation. A while ago, I made a video about this season right here, the 1966 season, where you had an incredibly bizarre scenario potentially unfolding in the Eastern Conference. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, to make a long story short, in 1966, there were no such things as tiebreakers in the NFL. So if there was a tie atop the conference for a spot in the NFL championship, you had to play a tiebreaker game. On the surface, and on its own, that's not a big deal. But what happens if there's a three-way tie? Since obviously, you can't have three teams playing at once. Well, that's the chaotic scenario that the NFL was faced with in 1966. So they had to figure out a three-way tiebreaker involving a few coin flips to determine who would host the first game, who would get a bye into the championship, and everything else along those lines. It was a mess, it was chaotic, and it almost took place on Christmas, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, fortunately, that crisis was averted, and the Cowboys won the Eastern Conference outright, so there was no need for an extra playoff game or a three-way tie. Having said that, you would think that other football leagues would learn their lesson and would learn not to have situations where something like this was possible. Heck, after that 1966 season, when the NFL moved to a four-division system, they got rid of the tiebreaker game and the extra playoff game, simply because they didn't have anywhere to put it in their calendar if it were to happen. And they created a series of tiebreakers to break any ties atop the standings to determine a spot in the playoffs. Granted, there weren't a lot of tiebreakers. We saw how this very nearly backfired on the league in 1970, when they were one New York Giants home win against the Los Angeles Rams away from having the final spot in the playoffs in the NFC being decided by a coin flip, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But at least there were preemptive measures in place, however minuscule they may have been, to prevent a situation like the one you've been watching this whole time, with a three-way debacle between the Dallas Cowboys, the St. Louis Cardinals, and the Cleveland Browns. But while that would make sense, oh, you would be mistaken. Very, very mistaken. Because in 1968, the rival American Football League was in a similar predicament, where there was a very realistic chance that their season could be decided by not just a two-way tie atop the Western Division, but rather a three-way tie. And to say that this scenario, much like the 1966 scenario in the NFL 2 years earlier, would have caused a ton of chaos, a ton of confusion, and a ton of controversy would be putting it lightly. Because this is the story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances, the dumbest playoff scenario in the history of the American Football League, and one of the dumbest playoff scenarios in the history of professional football. Before I talk about the ridiculous scenario at play here, and what exactly was going on, and why this was such a mess, we need some context to understand how the AFL playoffs looked, and how they were structured. In 1968, the AFL was the same as it always has been. First place or nothing. There was no such thing as the wild card. You had to win your division, or else you were mathematically eliminated from playoff contention. And with this team right here, the New York Jets, they were making life incredibly easy in the Eastern Division. No drama whatsoever. You could make the argument that they were the only competent team in the East, as they were the only team that finished this season with a winning record, ending the year a whopping 4 games ahead of the second-place Houston Oilers with an 11-3 record. Led by their superstar quarterback in Joe Namath, and a suffocating defense that allowed the fewest total yards and the fewest rushing yards in the league, the Jets won their last 4 games and 8 of their last 9 to cruise into the playoffs as division champions for the first time ever. As a side note, if you want to learn more about the lone loss in that stretch, which was the infamous Heidi game, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. So, easy enough in the East. That's half of the AFL covered. But what about the West? What about the other division? Well, that's a bit more dicey to say the least. Because by the middle of November, the situation was extremely murky, and the division was up for grabs. The expansion Cincinnati Bengals and the below 500 Denver Broncos had nothing to play for but pride. But the other three teams? Nothing was separating them. In one corner, you had this team right here, the 8-2 Kansas City Chiefs. Through this point in the season, no team was better defensively than Kansas City, who, despite playing an extra game compared to a lot of other teams in the league, still had the best defense in the league, allowing 133 points, or just 13.3 points per game. This was a Kansas City team that, at one point, had rattled off 6 straight wins, and would finish the year with the best rushing offense in the league, rushing for over 2,200 yards behind guys like Robert Holmes, Mike Garrett, and Wendell Hayes. Their defense was magnificent, as in their first 10 games, they allowed 10 points or less in 6 of them, and they had one 4-game stretch where they allowed just 15 points total, with 1 touchdown allowed in that stretch. Bottom line, the Chiefs were a really good team, and with 4 games to go, they were atop the Western Division for a reason. But right behind them in another corner, half a game behind at 7-2, you had this team right here, the Oakland Raiders. The Raiders had an insanely dominant offense that through 9 games had scored 296 points, or close to 33 points per game. This was the top total in the league, and there was only one other team that was averaging 30 points per game, which we'll get to in a little bit. In fact, the Raiders were so dominant offensively that over their last 3 games by this point, not only did they go 3-0, but they did so by scoring 112 points, or an average of well over 40 points per game. This was a Raiders team that eclipsed the 30-point mark in 6 of their first 9 games, and that would finish the season with the most points and the most yardage of any team in football. And they were no slouch defensively either. Their 137 points allowed by this point, giving them the top point differential in the league at plus 159, was the second fewest points allowed, only behind the Kansas City Chiefs. And not only were the Raiders 7-2, but they had a fairly easy schedule the rest of the way on paper, as not only did they have more home games than road games over the final 5, but they had more games against teams below 500 than games against teams above 500. So even though the Chiefs were a really good team, they could not rest on their laurels, because the Raiders were right behind them. And that's not all, because in a third corner, right next to them, also half the game behind the Chiefs at 7-2, you had this team right here, the San Diego Chargers. Remember how I said earlier that there was only one other team remotely in the same ballpark as the Raiders offensively by this point? This was that team, as the Chargers, thanks to the great play of their quarterback John Hadl, found themselves with maybe the most consistent offense in football. Consider this. Through their first 9 games, they scored at least 20 points in all 9 of those games. You always knew that the Chargers were going to show up on that side of the ball. And defensively, they weren't bad either. They had the 3rd best defense in the league, allowing just 170 points through their first 9 games, or under 19 points per game. The top 3 defenses in the AFL at this point in the season all resided in the West, and 3 of the top 4 offenses, and the only 4 offenses to score more than 175 points thus far, with the exception of the Jets, resided in the West. Of the 3 teams, the Chargers definitely had the least amount of room for error, simply because their schedule down the stretch included games against the Jets, Chiefs, and Raiders. Neither the Chiefs nor Raiders had to play all 3 other teams above 500, as at least that part of the schedule was done for them. But the Chargers were still very much in this race at just half a game behind. And if John Hadl and the best 1-2 receiving combo in the league in Lance Allworth and Gary Garrison could keep this up, you never know. You just never know. So you have the 3 teams that you're going to be watching through alternating footage, fighting for that division title, and a shot to go to the AFL Championship, and a chance to represent the league in Super Bowl III. You have the 8-2 Kansas City Chiefs, you have the 7-2 Oakland Raiders, and you have the 7-2 San Diego Chargers. Which raises the question, what happens if all 3 of these teams tie? If 2 teams tie, you just do what you've always done and determine the location of the championship with a coin flip. In fact, I did a video on that very same scenario happening for this 1968 season. So if you want to watch me discuss the ramifications of that and how that worked out, you can click the card in the upper right corner. But in that video that I did 2 years ago, I never talked about the 3-way tiebreaker, So seeing as I brought it up in yesterday's NFL-related video, this feels like a good avenue to revisit that topic and talk about the three-way tiebreaker from an AFL perspective. Because there is no three-sided coin. Surely, you have some sort of tiebreaker system to determine a possible situation in which three teams are tied atop the division that doesn't result in the flip of a coin. However, that did not happen. Not in the slightest bit. Because you guessed it, in the event that there was a three-way tie between the Chiefs, the Raiders, and the Chargers, the three teams you're watching, the format would be determined by a coin flip. Under this format, in a three-way tie, based on the flip of the coin, the San Diego Chargers would not only get a bye week, but to add insult to injury, they would get to host. Kansas City would travel to Oakland for the Western Division semifinal, and the winner of that game would travel to San Diego for the Western Division final. Which, yeah, I had many problems with this format, because this might be the dumbest playoff scenario in the history of the AFL. And that's saying a lot, seeing as there have been quite a few seasons where they decided things with a coin flip. Number one, at least back in previous seasons, you can make the argument that no one thought to think of a tiebreak system to determine home field advantage and seeds and first place and whatnot. You can make the argument that this was just the way it was. When the AFL had such systems in place before for prior division playoffs, like 1963 between the Buffalo Bills and the New England Patriots, the NFL was doing the same thing. So you could at least give them somewhat of a pass because we're looking at this through a modern lens where something like this seems obvious today. But back then, might not have been. But in 1968, the NFL literally had a system of tiebreakers implemented. They could not afford to have extra playoff games. They didn't have any room in the schedule. So they had to come up with a tiebreak, saying in a very soccer-like format that whichever team with a higher point differential across the two divisional games played between the teams tied advances. You might be asking what happens if those two teams are tied in point total, since you can't exactly go to a penalty kick shootout. And oh man, that's a story for a few days from now, because you're not going to believe the second tiebreaker that the NFL used in that case. But at least they had a tiebreaker system. The AFL had no excuse, none whatsoever. A system like this existed. Determining things with a coin flip was a ridiculous method for something like this, especially when systems were in place that they could have just borrowed and used and tweaked to their liking. Number two, how is this system fair to this team right here, the New York Jets? I think we can all agree that giving teams a bye week is beneficial. If you have a week off, that's great. You can rest up, you can get healthy, you don't have to take a beating, and you have extra time to repair than your opponent does. There is a reason that teams fight for that bye week and fight to get that time off. But there is such a thing as too much rest. And under this format, the Jets would have a double bye. They play their final game of the regular season on December 15th against the Miami Dolphins, and then would have off until the AFL Championship on January 5th, a whole 3 weeks later. That is a lot of time to accumulate rust. So congratulations, AFL. You created a system that quite literally is unfair to all the parties involved, including a team that's not even playing in the dang thing. And number three, you're telling me that the Chargers get the bye week under this scenario between the three teams you're watching, but they get to host the Western Championship too? How the heck is that fair? Seriously, how is that fair? They don't have to play the extra game, and they get to host the next game? That's like having a road trip with 3 other people in the car, and the back seat is super uncomfy, because there's not a lot of legroom, and the seats don't have the ability to recline or heat up, and the air conditioning isn't great. So you devise a system where on the first leg of the trip, Joe sits in shotgun, Caleb sits on the left side, and Ronald sits on the right side. And on the second leg of the trip, Caleb sits on the right side, Ronald sits on the left side, and Joe sits in shotgun. What the heck did Joe do to earn shotgun privileges both times? Screw Joe. Screw that leech. He's on aux too. He gets to control the music at the same time. How is this fair? At the very least, the fair thing to do here with a 3-way system, if you had to do it like this, was to say that the winner of the playoff game between the Chiefs and the Raiders would host the Chargers in the Western Division title. At least in that case, there was a somewhat fair trade-off. You get the week off, but you sacrifice home field advantage as a result. Instead, you created a system where the Chargers made out like absolute bandits for no reason whatsoever. You couldn't have seriously just created a tiebreaker system that didn't involve this? Which raises the ultimate question. How did this play out in the end? Well, there's a reason that you probably have never heard of this disastrous tiebreaker before and this absolutely chaotic format. And that is because the Chargers decided to do us all a favor and completely collapse down the stretch, leaving us with this as the Western Division playoff between Kansas City and Houston, which was determined by a coin flip, although the Raiders completely dominated and won that one 41-6. The Chiefs did not lose another regular season game the rest of the way. They finished the season 12-2. The Raiders did not lose another regular season game the rest of the way. They finished the season 12-2, although things definitely got dicey with the Heidi game. But the Chargers ended up losing 3 of their final 5 games, getting blown out by the Jets and Chiefs, and losing to the Raiders, to end the year with a 9-5 record. Their defense, which had not allowed more than 28 points in any of their first 10 games, allowed 34 or more in 3 of their final 4, and the offense just fell apart, turning it over 13 times in the final 2 weeks when they absolutely needed to win. So you were left with a fairly normal, fairly traditional tiebreaker scenario with this game right here, Chiefs-Raiders, being decided by a coin flip in terms of which team would host. It's crazy that they had to decide it by a coin flip and couldn't use any other tiebreaker that wasn't by complete chance, but at least it wasn't the 3-way tiebreaker where the Chargers made out better than the United States when they purchased Alaska. At least we had that going for us with this insane format. So, small victories whenever you can get them. Before I go any further, apologies for my voice in this video. I don't know what is up with my voice. I think I might be coming down with a bit of a cold, but gotta power through. The show must go on, especially this late in the season. Anyways, in 1969, the following season, the AFL had 2 wildcards, one in each division. So they had 4 teams in the playoffs, and that meant that they had to do a tiebreaker system and finally implement that because they didn't have any room in the schedule for extra playoff games, much like the NFL. So this 1968 season was the last time ever that something like this was even possible. So crisis was averted, even though it never should have gotten to that point. Oh, and one other thing. The helmets behind me, in this case right here, and the direction of the helmets are arranged for a very particular reason. Do you think you know the reason? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. It has to do with the story. Now keep in mind, it doesn't matter what the logos look like or the style of the helmets, just the order of the helmets and the direction that they are facing. Again, if you think you know, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below because this is the toughest version of the scheme that we have played so far. It feels incredibly unfair that after a long season where you have a large sample size and where you're determining wins and losses and accolades and everything in between on the field, that everything can be decided by the flip of a coin. An entire playoff round can be decided by the flip of a coin. But in 1968, that's exactly what happened in the AFL. And I don't just mean what we ended up getting and what I talked about before in that previous video about the coin flip determining the site of the Western Conference playoff right here between Kansas City and Oakland. I mean a 3-team tiebreaker determined entirely by a coin flip, where one team gets every conceivable benefit under the sun. Because in 1968, when it came to the battle between the Chiefs, the Raiders, and the Chargers, the flip of a coin was very nearly how the West was won. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.